In the far western edge of a small Midwestern town, where cornfields stretched into the horizon and the wind carried the quiet scent of dry leaves and soil, Henry Walker lived in a weathered wooden house that had long stopped trying to look young. The paint on its walls had faded into a dull gray, and the porch creaked with every step, but the house stood firm, much like the man who lived inside it. Henry was an old man, well into his 70s, with hands hardened by decades of honest labor and eyes that had learned to look gently at the world, even when the world had not always been gentle in return. He had no wife waiting for him inside the house, no children coming home for holidays, no photographs of family lining the walls, only silence, memory, and a single loyal companion named Buddy. Buddy was an old dog too, his once golden fur now streaked with white, his movements slower than they had been in younger days, but his presence beside Henry was constant. Wherever the old man went, Buddy followed at a respectful pace, never pulling ahead, never lagging too far behind, as if he understood that their lives were bound together by more than habit. It was trust, shared time, and the quiet agreement of two souls who had learned how to endure. Their days were simple and unremarkable to most, marked by modest routines, tending a small patch of vegetables behind the house, fixing what could still be fixed, walking the dirt road that led into town, and returning home before the evening cold settled in. Meals were plain, soup stretched thin, bread grown stale, vegetables harvested late, but Henry never complained, and Buddy never expected more than what was given. In the long autumn afternoons, when the sky hung low and pale and the wind swept fallen leaves across the yard, the two would sit together on the porch, watching the day fade, neither feeling the need to fill the silence with words or sound. It was a quiet life, and to some, it might have looked like a lonely one, but Henry had learned long ago that loneliness did not always come from being alone. Sometimes it came from having too much and still feeling empty. Just down the road, close enough to see but far enough to feel like another world, stood a large white house that seemed untouched by time. It belonged to Margaret Collins, a woman whose name carried weight in the town, spoken with respect by some and restraint by others. Her property was wide and well kept, the lawn trimmed neatly even as autumn claimed the rest of the land, the windows polished to reflect the light cleanly. Margaret had money, land, and a history of influence that stretched back years, and she carried herself as someone who expected the world to acknowledge that fact. Inside her home, warmth came easily, thick rugs, heavy curtains, and soft furnishings that kept the cold out and comfort in. And there, often resting on a cushion near the window or draped lazily across the arm of a chair, was Whisper, her prized cat. Whisper's fur was smooth and pale, groomed to perfection, her movements elegant and deliberate, her eyes sharp with the confidence of a creature that had never known hunger or fear. Margaret adored her cat, but it was the kind of affection that came from ownership rather than understanding, a love rooted in control and appearance rather than patience or kindness. When Margaret passed Henry on the road or glimpsed him from a distance, she rarely acknowledged him, and when she did, her gaze held nothing more than mild disdain, as if poverty itself were a personal failing she could not tolerate witnessing. To her, Henry was a reminder of something uncomfortable, a life without comfort, without status, without visible success, and she preferred not to dwell on such things. Buddy, sensing the tension in those moments, would stay close to Henry's side, his ears relaxed, his posture calm, unconcerned with judgment he neither understood nor needed. The town itself sat quietly between these two lives, unaware of the silent contrast playing out day after day. People greeted Henry politely, sometimes kindly, sometimes distractedly, while Margaret received smiles that carried obligation as much as admiration. No one openly compared the two, yet the difference was unmistakable. One man had almost nothing, yet moved through the world with steady humility. One woman had everything she could want, yet seemed perpetually guarded, distant, and unsatisfied. Autumn deepened, and the air grew sharper, bringing with it the promise of colder days ahead, but for now, the town rested in a moment of stillness. Two houses stood within sight of one another, one modest and worn, the other grand and pristine, each sheltering lives shaped by vastly different values. At the edge of the field, Henry and Buddy walked home together as the sun dipped low, while in the White House down the road, Margaret closed her curtains against the evening chill, Whisper curling comfortably at her feet. Two lives, two ways of being, neither yet aware that before the season ended, their paths would cross in a way that would test character, kindness, and the quiet truth that wealth is not always measured by what one owns. The next morning arrived wrapped in a pale autumn light, the kind that softened edges and made even worn places seem gentle, and as was his habit, Henry Walker walked the dirt road toward the town market with Buddy moving quietly at his side. Market day was one of the few routines that still connected Henry to the rest of the town, not because he had much to buy, but because it reminded him that life continued beyond his small house and garden. The market itself was modest, a cluster of wooden stalls set up near the old brick building on Main Street, where familiar faces gathered more out of habit than necessity, exchanging nods, weather remarks, and the slow rhythm of small-town life. Buddy stayed close, his leash loose, his steps measured, knowing from long experience that near the end of the morning, the fish vendor sometimes set aside scraps, heads, bones, pieces no one wanted, that Henry could afford and Buddy would quietly enjoy later. The fish stall sat near the edge of the market, its sharp, clean smell cutting through the cool air, and behind it stood the fishmonger, a woman whose hands were rough from years of work and whose eyes missed very little. As the morning wore on, people drifted past, some stopping briefly, others lingering, until suddenly there was a pause in the usual flow, a hesitation that carried a subtle tension. The fishmonger frowned and leaned over her table, counting again what she already knew was wrong, and her voice rose just enough to draw attention as she realized one of her largest fish was gone. It was not the sort of loss that could be ignored, especially in a place where margins were thin and every sale mattered. Murmurs spread quickly, soft but persistent, like wind through dry leaves, and heads turned instinctively toward what did not fit, toward what was easiest to question. Buddy, sitting calmly near the stall, became the quiet center of that attention. No one accused him outright, no one raised a hand or pointed openly, but suspicion has a way of settling without words, and soon the glances carried meaning enough. Henry felt it before he fully understood it, the subtle shift in how people looked at him, and he lowered his eyes, his shoulders drawing inward as if to make himself smaller, less noticeable, less troublesome. Buddy sensed the change as well, not through language, but through tone, posture, and silence. He remained still, his tail resting on the ground, his ears relaxed, offering no sign of fear or guilt, because he had nothing to hide and no instinct to flee. Nearby, Margaret Collins stood at another stall, examining goods she had no real need for, her presence polished and assured, and when her gaze landed on Henry and the dog, a faint, knowing smile touched her lips. Whisper rested comfortably in her arms, her sleek body perfectly still, her eyes half-lidded with indifference, yet alert enough to observe the scene unfolding below her. Margaret did not speak, but her expression carried judgment effortlessly, reinforcing what others were already thinking without requiring her voice. To her, the assumption felt natural, almost obvious, as if a life of scarcity could not exist without temptation, as if poverty itself explained wrongdoing. The murmurs grew thicker, and though no one stepped forward to accuse Henry directly, the silence pressed harder than words might have. Henry stood there, his hands clasped in front of him, weathered fingers tightening slowly, his face calm but heavy with a familiar, quiet shame, not because he believed the accusation, but because he had lived long enough to know how easily such moments turned against people like him. Buddy looked up briefly, meeting Henry's gaze, and in that look was something steady and untroubled, a simple trust that did not ask for defense. The dog did not bark, did not whine, did not pull away, he simply sat and waited, as he always had, believing that stillness was sometimes the strongest answer. The fishmonger scanned the ground, the table, the surrounding faces, searching for certainty where there was none, and the crowd lingered, uncomfortable yet curious, drawn by the unspoken drama. Margaret adjusted her grip on Whisper, her posture straight, her chin lifted, her disapproval clear without effort, and Whisper's tail flicked once in quiet irritation as she looked down at Buddy with cool detachment. Eventually, the moment loosened, not because the truth was found, but because the market had its own rhythm that could not pause forever. People began to move again, conversations resumed, and the suspicion, though unresolved, settled into memory rather than action. Henry waited until the attention shifted elsewhere before quietly stepping away from the stall, Buddy rising and walking beside him as if nothing had changed, though something had. As they moved down the street, Henry's pace slowed, his breath deepening, the weight of unspoken judgment following him like a shadow, and Buddy stayed close, his presence steady and warm against the chill of the morning. Neither spoke, neither needed to, but the air between them carried a quiet understanding. In a town where everyone knew each other, being seen was not always a comfort, and being misunderstood could wound more deeply than open accusation. As the market faded behind them and the dirt road stretched ahead, Henry felt the familiar ache of knowing how quickly trust could erode and how easily kindness could be replaced by assumption. Buddy walked on, calm and patient, unaware of the words whispered, yet fully aware of the feeling they carried, and though he could not explain himself, he accepted the moment with the quiet dignity of a creature that knew its own truth. The wind lifted fallen leaves along the road, spinning them briefly before letting them settle again, and above them, the sky remained pale and indifferent, watching as a small injustice took root, unnoticed by most, but deeply felt by those who stood silently at its center. That evening settled over the town with a quiet heaviness, the kind that comes after something unresolved, and as Henry Walker returned to his small wooden house at the edge of the field, the wind carried the sharp smell of fallen leaves and cooling earth. Inside, the routine unfolded as it always had, slow and familiar, yet something subtle had shifted. Henry set aside a modest portion of food for Buddy, the same scraps and softened bread he offered every night, but the old dog did not move toward the bowl. Instead, Buddy lay near the door, his body still, his eyes open, watching the fading light slip through the narrow window. Hunger was a simple thing for a dog, usually quick and uncomplicated, but that night, Buddy felt something else pressing against instinct, something heavier than appetite. The memory of the market lingered, not as images or words, but as sensations, the sharp scent of fish, the tension in the air, the way the world had seemed to tighten around him as eyes turned cold. Most of all, there was the feeling of being watched without kindness, judged without understanding, a feeling Buddy did not have a name for, yet recognized all the same. Henry noticed the untouched food but said nothing, assuming perhaps that age had dulled Buddy's appetite, or that the long walk had simply tired him more than usual. He settled into his chair, the house creaking softly around them, and the two shared the silence as night deepened, each carrying his own thoughts in his own way. Later, when Henry stepped outside to latch the door against the cold, Buddy followed, padding quietly along the familiar path, and as they moved past the road that led toward Margaret Collins's property, Buddy slowed. The air shifted there, carrying a layered mix of scents, trimmed grass, polished wood, and beneath it all, something sharp and familiar that pulled his attention sharply. Buddy stopped at the edge of the fence, his body stiffening not with fear, but with focus. Near the corner of the garden, partially hidden beneath dry leaves and shadow, lay old fish bones, brittle and pale in the moonlight, and as Buddy lowered his head to investigate, the truth unfolded not as a thought, but as a certainty. The scent clinging to the bones was wrong, unmistakably so, layered with something he knew well yet did not carry himself. It was the faint, clean smell of a cat, mixed with the lingering trace of stolen food. Buddy sniffed slowly, carefully, taking his time as dogs do when instinct tells them something matters. The realization did not bring anger or excitement, it brought clarity. In that quiet moment, under a thin, silver moon, Buddy understood that what had happened at the market had not been random, nor had it been his doing. He lifted his head and looked toward the White House standing silent behind the fence, its windows dark, its walls clean and untouched, and though he could not piece together motives or intentions, he knew the simple shape of the truth. It was enough. Buddy stepped back, the leaves crunching softly beneath his paws, and followed Henry home without pulling or protest, his pace steady, his mind settled. Inside the house, Henry prepared for bed, unaware of what Buddy had found, unaware of the quiet burden his companion now carried, and when the lamps were extinguished and the night grew colder, Buddy did not curl into his usual spot by the hearth. Instead, he lay down by the front door, his body stretched along the wooden floor, his head resting between his paws, facing the dark. Sleep came lightly, broken by the sounds of the night, the distant cry of wind, the rustle of trees, the slow creak of the house settling, but Buddy remained there, alert yet calm, as if guarding not the door, but the moment itself. He did not need to speak or act yet. Dogs, after all, understand timing in ways humans often forget. Truth, Buddy sensed, did not rush, and forcing it too soon could scatter it like leaves in the wind. So he waited, breathing steadily, listening to the world turn quietly outside, trusting that morning would come and with it, an opportunity to let the truth reveal itself without violence or noise. Henry slept fitfully, troubled by vague unease he could not name, perhaps the lingering weight of the market, perhaps the subtle loneliness that crept in during colder nights, but when he stirred and glanced toward the door, he saw Buddy lying there, faithful as ever, and felt reassured without knowing why. The hours passed slowly, moonlight giving way to shadow, shadow giving way to the faint promise of dawn, and throughout it all, Buddy did not move from his place. He had accepted something new into his quiet understanding of the world, not resentment, not fear, but responsibility. He could not explain himself, could not correct the whispers or soften the glances with words, but he could remember, observe, and wait. In the stillness before morning, with the house breathing softly around him, Buddy embodied a truth often overlooked, that silence does not always mean submission, and patience, when guided by loyalty and instinct, can be a form of strength all its own. Morning arrived quietly, as it often did in the Midwest, with a pale sun lifting itself over the fields and a thin layer of frost clinging to the grass, and before Henry Walker had fully finished his first cup of weak coffee, Buddy was already awake and waiting by the door. There was something different in the dog's posture that morning, not restlessness or hunger, but purpose, steady and unmistakable. When Henry reached for his coat, Buddy moved closer, gently taking the edge of the sleeve in his mouth and pulling, not hard, not impatient, just enough to guide. Henry paused, surprised, then allowed himself to be led, sensing without understanding that this was not an ordinary walk. They followed the familiar dirt road back toward town, the same path they had taken the day before, yet now it felt altered, charged with something unspoken. Buddy walked slightly ahead, glancing back occasionally to be sure Henry was still there, his steps calm but firm, as if he knew exactly where they needed to go. The market was quieter in the early hours, stalls only just opening, the fish vendor arranging her display beneath a thick cloth to protect it from the cold night air. As Henry approached, uncertainty tugged at him, a faint instinct to turn back, to avoid the lingering discomfort of the previous day, but Buddy did not slow. When they reached the fish stall, Buddy stopped and lifted his head, his focus narrowing to the covered table. Without barking or drawing attention, he stepped forward and nudged the cloth with his nose, pulling it back just enough to expose what lay beneath. The motion was small, almost accidental in appearance, but its effect was immediate. The fishmonger leaned forward instinctively, her eyes catching on something out of place, a few fine strands of pale fur clinging to the fabric, tangled near shallow scratch marks left in the wood below. She froze, then looked again, closer this time, her expression shifting as recognition dawned. This was not the coarse hair of a dog, nor the marks of teeth, these were narrow claw lines, precise and light, and the fur was unmistakably feline. The quiet around the stall deepened as others nearby noticed the change in her demeanor, curiosity drawing them closer, and soon the murmurs began again, but this time they carried a different tone. Someone went to fetch Margaret Collins, whose presence in the market was as predictable as Henry's, though her arrival was usually marked by confidence rather than hesitation. When she approached the stall, Whisper nestled in her arms, alert and composed, Margaret's expression already edged with irritation at being summoned. The fishmonger did not accuse or argue, she simply held up the cloth and gestured downward, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. Whisper was set gently on the ground, her tail flicking once as she stood beside the stall, and when the fishmonger compared the loose strands of fur caught in the fabric to the cat's sleek coat, the match was undeniable. The crowd fell silent, the realization settling heavily as eyes shifted from Henry and Buddy to Margaret and Whisper. Henry stood back, his hands trembling slightly, not from triumph, but from the sudden release of tension he had carried since the day before. Buddy sat at his side, his posture relaxed, his role complete, offering no sign of pride or accusation, only calm certainty. Margaret's face tightened, her composure cracking not with shame, but with anger, sharp and uncontained. She reacted not by apologizing or reflecting, but by striking out, her hand lashing toward Whisper in a moment of raw frustration, the sound cutting sharply through the stillness. The cat recoiled, startled and confused, and before anyone could intervene, Margaret turned away, her heels clicking sharply against the ground as she left the market without a word, her back rigid, her dignity intact only in her own mind. No one followed her. The crowd remained where it was, absorbing the moment, the truth now clear and unarguable. The fishmonger exhaled slowly, shaking her head as if disappointed more than vindicated, and a few people murmured apologies toward Henry, quiet and awkward, unsure how to undo what had already been done. Henry nodded politely, accepting the gestures without bitterness, though the experience had left its mark. Buddy rose and pressed briefly against Henry's leg, a simple gesture of reassurance, then looked once toward the empty space where Margaret had stood, his expression unreadable but peaceful. The market resumed its rhythm soon after, as markets always do, but something subtle had shifted beneath the surface. Assumptions had been exposed, and though not everyone would admit it, a lesson had been quietly delivered. Henry and Buddy turned away and began the walk home together, the road stretching ahead of them under the widening sky, and for the first time since the incident, the air felt lighter. Buddy did not look back. He had done what instinct and loyalty required, not to prove innocence alone, but to restore balance where it had been disturbed. Truth, once revealed, did not need explanation, and as the leaves stirred along the roadside and the sun climbed higher, Henry felt a deep, steady gratitude, not for being proven right, but for having been accompanied by a quiet courage that asked for nothing in return. After the crowd dispersed and the market returned to its ordinary rhythm, Whisper remained behind, small and trembling against the cold ground, her pale fur no longer immaculate, her confidence gone as quickly as it had once appeared. The noise of the morning faded around her, footsteps moving away, voices lowering, and for the first time in her sheltered life, she was alone in a world that offered no immediate comfort. Buddy approached without hesitation, his movements slow and deliberate, stopping a short distance away, careful not to frighten her further. He did not bark or growl or assert himself in any way, he simply stood there, steady and present, as if to say that nothing more was required. Whisper watched him warily at first, her body tense, her instincts torn between fear and exhaustion, but Buddy remained still, his posture open, his eyes soft with something she had never encountered before. Henry, witnessing the quiet exchange, felt a heaviness settle in his chest, not of anger, but of understanding. He knew what it meant to be left behind, to be discarded not for wrongdoing, but for inconvenience, and with a slow sigh that carried years of lived experience, he bent down and lifted Whisper gently into his arms. There were no words spoken, no declarations made, the decision did not need explanation. They walked home together along the familiar dirt road, the old man, the old dog, and the frightened cat forming an unlikely procession beneath the pale afternoon sky. When they reached the small wooden house at the edge of the field, Henry set Whisper down carefully near the hearth, where warmth lingered even in daylight, and for a long moment, she did not move, her eyes wide as she took in her new surroundings. The house was simple, worn by time and weather, but it carried a quiet honesty in every creak and shadow, and Buddy lay down a short distance away, not invading her space, but not abandoning her either. The first days were difficult. Whisper flinched at sudden sounds, hissed softly when startled, and retreated into corners when footsteps approached too quickly. She had known luxury, but not gentleness, attention, but not patience. Henry moved slowly around her, respecting her fear, offering food without expectation, and Buddy remained a constant presence, never pressing, never withdrawing, embodying a calm that gradually began to soften her defenses. Meals were shared without ceremony, bowls placed side by side, neither creature favored nor neglected, and in time, Whisper began to eat without trembling, to sleep without waking at every sound. The nights grew colder as autumn deepened, and sometimes Whisper would inch closer to the warmth of Buddy's resting place, not touching at first, then eventually allowing herself to rest beside him, comforted by the steady rhythm of his breathing. In that small house, there was no judgment, no hierarchy, no demand to perform or impress. There was only space to exist as one was. Henry continued his routines, tending the garden, walking the road into town, returning each evening to a home that now held more life than it had before, and though money remained scarce, warmth was not. Across the road, in the large white house that stood untouched by change, Margaret Collins lived on as she always had, surrounded by polished surfaces and quiet rooms that echoed with absence. Her days continued in comfort, her needs met without effort, yet the space where Whisper had once curled remained empty, a detail easy to ignore by day and harder to avoid by night. Whether she ever thought of the cat she left behind, whether regret ever stirred beneath her pride, no one could say. The town did not ask, and Margaret did not offer. Seasons moved forward, as they always do, and life settled into new patterns shaped not by wealth or reputation, but by small acts of quiet compassion. The story did not end with apology or transformation, nor did it demand one. It ended with a modest house standing firm against the wind, sheltering those who had found their way there, and with the understanding that sometimes goodness does not announce itself, does not seek reward or recognition, but simply opens the door and makes room. In a world that often measures value by possession and appearance, there remained one place, humble and overlooked, where kindness was enough, and for those who lived within it, that was a wealth no season could take away.